and thoughts and comments and things you're interested in on the hashtag CHIFest 2020. And we have a great panel for you today. We will be doing a little introduction from all of them, and then an opportunity for some discussion and Q&A. And I feel free, I think you've got access to a Q&A panel. Feel free to drop questions in as they come to you, and I'll arrange them for when we have the session halfway through. So I wanted just to introduce the topic and my panel today. So like I said, I'm Nancy Hay. I'm the Executive Director at the What Works Centre for Wellbeing, and our discussion is on the role of wellbeing in accelerating impact at a time of crisis. And we'll be talking quite a lot about what wellbeing means, what it's the impact it has on physical, mental and social and other types of aspects of our lives, and hopefully some practical some tips from people who've been in a whole range of different circumstances. So hoping work through those ideas for us as well, sharing their experience in a range of contexts. So for well-being, for me, is well-being is how we're doing. And how sustainable that is for the future. And that how we're doing can be physical, social, emotional, but also economic, and all the other things that are around us that make life worth living. But also some of the things that happen now can have longer term impacts. And so I think mostly we'll be talking about the sort of the psychological, emotional, and social aspects of the current experience over lockdown. But and we'll talk about what that might mean for the future as well. So I think it's probably time for us to introduce your panel. So I'm really joined today by three great speakers. I hope you will learn a lot from them, as I've already done in speaking to them, preparing for this session. So we have Dr. Hannah Carver, who is a lecturer in substance use at the University of Stirling, who'll be talking about the frontline staff wellbeing work she's been doing, but also has a range of experience across green space, peer support, working with vulnerable populations, harm reduction, and other works, and particularly around qualitative methodology. We've also got Remy Olajoy Egbe, who is a strategic impact coach and mentor and social entrepreneur who has got a long-standing interest in homelessness, and will be able to talk to you about sort of the dialogue she's been having with people working through this lockdown period, and what the themes are from that and what we can practically do. And I'm also really delighted to be joined by Hannah Green, who is the lived experience specialist here at the Centre for Homelessness Impact. And she will be sharing her experience of homelessness and what strengths that has given her in terms of resilience in dealing with this current situation. So we've got a really great panel for you today, and I'm really looking forward to learning from them. I'm going to turn, I think, to Dr. Hannah Carver first, who will share a little bit about her research on the frontline staff wellbeing at the moment, but also will be here for later on for us to ask questions about a broad range of things if she wants to. So Hannah, can I bring you in on the microphone now?
Thanks, Nancy. So I'm based at the University of Stirling in Scotland, and my research generally focuses on the kind of intersections between homelessness and substance use, within particular harm reduction approaches, as well as young people's substance use, mental health and well-being a bit more generally, as well as peer-delivered interventions and some work on green space and the benefits to mental health. And as Nancy said, I was invited to speak in this webinar because I'm currently leading a study looking at frontline homelessness service staffs, health, well-being, kind of mental health, well-being and stress during COVID. And that's a 6-month qualitative study involving interviews, but also looking at kind of more objective measures of stress. And was funded by the Chief Scientist Office in Scotland. So it involves interviews with staff to find out a bit more about what's going on for them. And we know that obviously working within homelessness services is really challenging, but people get a lot out of it. And there can often be high levels of burnout and staff turnover, particularly working with people who are traumatised. And given the kind of impact of working within the COVID experience, but also with I think the kind of context around obviously substance use, where there might be lots of additional deaths due to drugs and alcohol, put a lot of impact on staff. So we know things like reflective practice, supervision, staff meetings and training are really important for staff wellbeing, but we also kind of recognise that during a pandemic, things are a bit up in the air and we don't really know if these things are available. So we're doing interviews with staff in a range of services across Scotland to find out a bit more about how they're coping, what their support needs are, and what kind of strategies they're doing. And I guess developing key lessons for the sector. How do we kind of ensure staff are supported during a pandemic, but also what's really important more generally for staff. So I'll talk a little bit about what we've found so far, but we're at the kind of really early stages and lots of interesting data is coming out, particularly around team working and the kind of needs about how you kind of manage a team within a really complex situation as it is now. So I'll hopefully talk a bit more about that later.
Thanks, Hannah. And yeah, it's great to hear some of the workplace literature referred to. So some of the things that the What Works Centre does looks at the role of wellbeing at work and the role of, we know that health and relationships in particular are the most important things, but also I think the population and the services that you're working with can sometimes be, what's the impact of the pandemic on those as well. So understanding what people are doing, what people need both now, but what can we learn generally for what this might mean for the workplace in the future and what that can be. So that's fantastic. Thank you very much for sharing. And I'm sure we'll have some further questions in a minute. I also want to introduce Remy and to hear a little bit more about how she's been working with people, about how they're coping and what sort of things are coming up for people and what practically they're doing. So Remy, can I ask you to speak now?
Yeah, sure. Hi, Nancy, and hello to everyone that's watching. My name's Remy. Just like to say thank you all for inviting me to join the discussion. I'm particularly delighted to support the Centre for Homelessness Impact because, as I mentioned to Nancy before we came on, I actually wrote my master's thesis on homeless 20 years ago. So I've got a long standing interest in the subject. I'm now a mentor and a strategic coach. My work specifically is dedicated to female empowerment, female leadership, personal growth and transformation. So as we live through these extraordinary times, my work really supports people to find and move towards their chosen paths, define and hone their purpose and impact, and build resilience and maintain hope, which is an important part, especially during this incredible point of inflection, but also period of reflection. I think self-inquiry feels more significant than ever now, actually, as we've been forced by this global crisis to explore and address many of our personal and professional lives and needs. And so during lockdown, aside from my private practice, I actually ran a weekly women's group, which was called the How Do We Dialogues, just to look at some of the questions that we face as leaders, professionals, caregivers, support providers in various ways to, you know, various groups, family, friends, community, organisation, and so just the complexity of that, given the increasing calls on our time and resources, which felt like they intensified in a matter of days and weeks. You know, how are we to juggle these simultaneous challenges? And for me personally, I'm a mum to a 6-year-old little girl, so parenting challenges came up, working from home came up, homeschooling, an even more demanding workload. All of that showed up for me. And so I was just curious as to how we could stay well balanced and work with these super challenging dynamics. So I think it fits well with what we're going to discuss today. And actually, I wanted to correct myself and say that for many of us, we are not working from home. We're actually at home trying to work. And I think that is a hugely important distinction, because during our group discussions of the How Do We Dialogues, a lot of stuff that needed to be given a voice was surfaced around those issues. And so I don't want to take up too much time, Nancy, because I'm sure you'll ask us on our thoughts as to what we can do in such times. But I thought it might just be helpful to just whiz through a sort of a list of some of the themes that came up. So the one that was fascinating and was sort of quite hard to grasp initially, but it was this sense of the invisible becoming very visible, whether it was our homes or our families, and the fact that there was no real adjustment to this level of exposure, and what that can actually bring up for people naturally. So that was a big theme. The lack of designated space, physically and metaphorically, presented real challenges for people. That was a big theme. I'd say that was very much relevant in terms of the internal space and external spaciousness. I think everybody struggled with a total lack of structure and clear boundaries in our day-to-day. So poor or no delineation between personal and professional time felt very stressful. And at a time when many professionals were trying to step up, do more, be more, but were just hugely under-resourced. How do we cope with our families? I mean, lots of us are not used to being around our families or with our children as much as we had to be during lockdown. And so that surfaced real discomfort and guilt. So it was really good to unpack and explore that because that was something that was, quite widely held. Lack of transition time, specifically our own rhythms were out of sync. The train ride that you have to do your online shop on, or the walk to the station where you listen to a podcast, or the call to the friend. So those transition times were missing. And a lot of people found that quite stressful because, of course, we take it for granted that we've got time to get ready for work. And yet suddenly we weren't screen ready and we were having to work in this new way. So that was a very interesting transition, or lack of transition time. Leaving work suddenly became about shutting your laptop, much harder to do when you've got then all your other life requirements that are needing to be managed online. And yet, if you're out of the office, you put your out of office on, right? So, this whole period drove us all back online, which was very fatiguing and very vague in terms of how we managed it, because of course we've never had to do so in quite this quantum or way. What else? Healthy habits. Many people found healthy habits really hard to hold on to at this time, because their workload increased, support decreased, and so the self-care piece was often really compromised. And of course, when you're trying to form new habits and patterns of behaviour, trying to do that under stressful circumstances isn't ideal. Negotiating fairly set roles and boundaries was very challenging. Who does more childcare? Whose job is a priority at this time? Not feeling equipped to handle those dialogues on top of the other very stressful dialogues that were happening as a result of the pandemic. So that was a big theme. Depending on the organisation, of course, but the sense of business as usual, it was still present for some people in terms of a lack of compassionate handling and a mindful leadership of some of the issues that people were really facing. And then I think internally, what really affected well-being, I'd say one of the biggest things was media consumption. And I've said throughout this pandemic, if you want to maintain a healthy diet, we watch what we eat, and the same applies for media. And yet we saw a voracious consumption of media and just a never-ending feeling of flow of media, stories and articles and things constantly updating us, and that really affected people's state of mind. And so being able to manage that and be aware of that was a huge piece towards well-being. The different types of loneliness that gripped people in different ways was another huge piece. Some of us had contact with others, that was possible. For some that was great, for others it wasn't so nourishing and healthy, or others weren't able to contact others because you lived alone or you were shielding. And so it really showed up this need to understand more sensitively and analyse loneliness and isolation. And then lastly, I would say, there's a whistle-stop tour, there's other things, but lastly, I would say the impact of the perceived lack of visibility. So when we're in our work environments, we're seen to do our jobs, we're witnessed doing our jobs. And so being behind a screen the whole time actually seemed to be quite triggering for people. And I think when we discussed it more, our identities often are comprised with sort of how we work and what we do. So there was something around, validation and witnessing being impacted. But I've probably gone way over time, so I'll stop there because there's lots to share.
Thank you. So you see people nodding along as we come along to all these points, and I have small children in the background, so I can totally empathise with the challenge of at home working with the multiple activities on. And actually, it's one of the things that we've seen quite a lot is we've been encouraged to bring our whole selves to work and inclusive people at work, and actually suddenly we're very at work at home together at the same time, and there's no choice in that in the same way. So I think I can see lots of nodding on that as well. And I've got some questions for later as well. So how we take the line between on the media consumption side of it, which would be quite exciting. So I'll just hold the questions out, keep them coming, and I'll log them for later. I wanted to ask Hannah Green to share a little bit about her experience and what she's been able to draw on to bring resilience in this slightly odd world that we're in at the moment.
Yeah, so I'm the lived experiences specialist at the Centre for Homelessness Impact, and before that I was actually homeless myself for over a year. So I kind of moved into my own place, and then all of a sudden we had lockdown, which was like really strange. And at first it was tough, obviously, going from like sofa surfing and staying in a hostel with 18 other young people and staff 24 hours a day to completely on my own, and then not able to see my friends. But then I think that my experiences of homelessness, and I guess life more generally, contributed in quite a big way to kind of my resilience and my approach and mindset in terms of lockdown. So when you're homeless, you've got to kind of learn to deal with the unexpected. You just have to get on with it and make the best of bad situations. You don't always have options. And when you don't know where you're going to be sleeping from one night to the next, and there's nothing you can do about it, you kind of have to develop thick skin. I also think that probably my experiences of trauma have also contributed to that mindset. And it's worth saying, at the beginning of lockdown, I did struggle for the first few weeks with the fear of the unknown and the lack of, I guess, control. But for me, it was kind of telling myself that I'd been through way worse. And that's kind of what got me through the first few weeks. And then it kind of got to the point where I felt like the rest of the world had caught up with my usual levels of kind of panic and anxiety. So I just had this kind of calm feeling, which was really strange. And then, the last 5 months has kind of been the least chaotic my life has ever been. So, I know that's not the case for most people. But when you've had to focus on survival kind of your whole life, lockdown is, I'm not going to say it's easy because that's not true. But it's definitely made me more resilient and more able to cope with lockdown. And I think part of that comes down to acceptance. And, I had to learn to focus on the things that I can control when I was homeless. And then kind of learning to accept feelings and unpleasant emotions. And yeah, I read some research this morning actually that said it turns out not enough adversity can be just as harmful as too much, and I thought that was really interesting. And it's all well and good me sitting here and saying my experiences of homelessness and trauma made me more resilient, but that shouldn't be the case. We should be able to find resilient human beings who haven't had to go through adversity. But we can come back to that later.
Thank you, Hannah. I was just thinking that one is the difficult bit essential for that resilience to grow.
Exactly.
Was like, do you have to suffer for your art? Is the classic argument, and I suspect you probably don't have to. Although there are things, if you have suffered, you can draw from it. It was really interesting here. You talk about sort of the fear of the unknown and the lack of control, and we're human doings more than human beings, and when we feel that out of control, we like to do stuff, and actually we haven't been able to. The choice is gone. And there's a sort of the feeling of acceptance that you described. I also wanted to reflect back that this everybody else has caught up with my normal level of anxiety, and the sense of calm that brings. And I think I've heard that from other people who've suffered from anxiety in particular, who said this is how I feel all the time. And in some ways that simplification has helped them a little bit as the world has come to understand. Thank you so much for sharing your experience, and I can see people are nodding and reflecting that as well. I'm going to take the chair's liberty to ask some questions a little bit about what is it that's really worked well or helped, and that you're finding that people are bringing to this. So we've described quite a lot of the challenges and some of the strengths that people have brought to it, and what is it that's worked well? I think I was going to ask Hannah Carver to come in first on that question. What is it people are finding helps?
So I mentioned that quite a lot of the work on our staff wellbeing study has kind of focused on teams. So I guess we were kind of went out there expecting there to be a lot of challenges around working with people who are homeless in a pandemic, for some of the reasons Hannah's mentioned, but also the challenges of working in the lockdown. So kind of how do you manage people who are maybe having to leave for various reasons and trying to prevent them from doing that. But actually we found a lot of the our participants have been talking about how important it is to have a really strong staff team. And I think it's kind of, you see the cracks, I guess, for some teams, if they weren't strong before the pandemic, there are some cracks, but the teams that were really strong to begin with have kind of been able to support their staff more generally kind of as things are going on. And I guess Remy had mentioned similar things around kind of being in touch with lots of people and that kind of keeping in touch, making sure you're kind of informally and formally keeping in touch with your team seems to be really important, and making sure people are getting that kind of same level of support, supervision, a way to kind of talk about things that are going on both in their kind of work life but also personally, because we know how difficult it'll be when people have got kids, other caring responsibilities, and just dealing with their own kind of mental health and well-being. So I think it's kind of trying to encourage really good team working, both I guess within homelessness services but widely. So I work as part of a team, and it's really important that we all keep in touch and can talk formally and informally about what's going on, and just I guess supporting each other.
Thank you. It's really useful to hear team working come out so strongly, because actually that's reinforced by the evidence that we see about what makes a difference at work. So certainly having supportive colleagues, but when those structures go, you're in a remote environment, and what do you do to help manage remotely and things like that? It suddenly becomes quite a different bit. And we've seen some research from areas where people are in remote circumstances a long time. But one of the things we have seen is like, how do you build that resilience? Is that how can you build yourself being a better manager in this situation? Actually, there's a lot you can learn about how to manage people well that happen in this new environment. So that's quite exciting. I was going to ask Remy the same question, then I was going to go. I've got 3 questions from the panel, from the Q&A.
Is that so? The question is building resilience, or
so what's really helped? What has gone well? Made a difference to help people cope?
Yeah, okay. I mean, I think within organisations, of course within families as well, but organisationally, I think there needs to be this continuous acknowledging that we are in a crisis. It's almost sort of, it's not a static fact. And so as that unfolds, it brings up new challenges along the way. And that means we have to sort of foster and encourage new dialogues to happen, particularly at senior levels where, you know, people are under a huge amount of pressure. And I think that then helps people understand that expectations need to change, right? We are, you know, and that might be around deliverable timelines or core hours or team outputs, but prioritization needs to change. And once that prioritization can change, then that really helps promote well-being, because it eases to some of the pressure that's in the system that we are otherwise feeling quite confined by. So I think that's a piece that needs ongoing work within the context of what gets thrown up as we continually respond to the changing aspects of being within this context of a global pandemic, which is new for all of us, and how that then shifts our relationships with organizations and communities and families is really unique. And so I'm a true believer, and I see that the people that are having a much easier time now have really fostered those dialogues within their own companies. It's meant then that they, as teams or as individuals, and teamwork is really critical here because of course you're working remotely, so the sense of team is different, but you can then encourage colleagues to reset boundaries or take daily exercise or block out time for lunch and personal space, or, you know, be able to talk about how they're managing crisis management, so crisis schooling, crisis caring. I think that dialogue and that openness is very, very important. And I think what's been very, very helpful is when leaders are really open about their lived experience, which is, you know, it might look fine, but you know, beneath the veneer, there's chaos. that abounds in most homes, you know, and people are really trying to work that out. And I think some leaders have done that so brilliantly and been so authentic. I hate to overuse the word, but so authentic, that it's given others permission to just drop their shoulders and say, okay, as long as I can deliver in my way, you know, what's going on for me is okay, which I think is hugely important. I think the other thing that's worked really, really well as I speak to leaders is actually leaders who've become way more conscious about how they lead, because leadership styles have to change and adapt in this circumstance. I mean, I could waffle on forever, so I'll let you.
We might come back to leadership, but I've got a couple of questions in the Q&A, and I'm going to pick up Sam Price's question first, which is hopefully a quite quick one to Hannah Carver, which is, I'm really interested in your research. When will it be published, and is it UK-wide or just Scotland? And I know it was funded by Scotland and is a 6-month study. Hannah, can you help quickly on Sam's question?
Yeah, so it's just a Scottish study, but we're definitely thinking about how we can maybe look at long-term bigger studies, because there's definitely an interest more generally. So unfortunately just Scottish, and the study runs until November, so we should have results the end of the year, as I kind of force myself to write things as soon as possible. So yeah, I'm happy to send things out if people want to send me an email.
So there you go, Sam, you've given her a deadline now. Some accountability in there. Thank you very much. And then I have another question from Sam Pratt, which is, what's the best way to improve your resilience? And I'm wondering if Hannah Green might want to start with that question, and then we'll come across.
Yeah, I think that we need to be starting when kids are young, and not relying on adversity to make people more resilient. So encouraging children to be open about their thoughts and their feelings and talk if they're not doing okay, encouraging like self-care, being kind to themselves, you know, if they're struggling, taking a step back. And then when, like, obviously in a pandemic, still connecting with people. Obviously people keep throwing around the word social distancing, but it's physical distancing. We can still be connected to other people socially. And then more practically, kind of on a day-to-day level, things like routine, structure, sleeping properly and at regular times, exercise. That, for me, that's absolutely massive. But yeah, I think it's got to go back to when kids are young. I think that's where we need to start.
Thank you, Hannah. And I'm really interested in this idea that we can build resilience without relying on adversity to create it. And so some of the points that you make there are really well backed up by the research. So Public Health Wales did some research on resilience building, and they found 3 things really helped, some of which you've touched on. One is a trusted adult. 2 is supportive friends. And the 3rd is regular physical activity. And that takes us back to some of the sort of the sort of wellbeing promoting 5 ways, which is sort of be active, connect, give, keep learning, and the other ones of sort of sleep, physical activity, and nutrition that we kind of forget as well. It'd be great if we can. Does anybody else want to comment on resilience?
Just to say, you know, like I think it's really worth us, because we're going to hear this word a lot, really working out what resilience is, right? So the definition of resilience is the power to return to the original form, or after being bent or compressed, or to recover from illness. But in both those cases, I think resilience is about some type of recovery. And I think focusing on the end as to how we become resilient is of course very important, but there is often a journey to being able to build our resilience through some capacity of healing. And so I think for well-being, as Hannah said, you know, factoring in how we can heal those aspects of ourselves that might need attention, and it might be as simple as sleep and exercise for some people, and way more complex for other people. But I think there is something around the journey towards it, as opposed to it being the end game without fully understanding those steps. Just, you know, I don't know why, but I find that word sometimes, I think, wow, we're gonna, you know, we all want to step into resilience, but it's a process of recovery, I think.
Thank you. So yeah, so how we can grow and change and adapt.
Yeah.
And I think seeing Greg is commenting similar, so adapting and changing how we do this would be quite exciting as well. So I've got two other questions here. One from Linda Perkins saying, is there any advice for employers who will likely have staff at home and at increased risk of domestic abuse? I think that's what DA is our saying. Is there somebody who would like to comment on that straight off, or maybe quite a specific question? So nobody in the panel is immediately jumping forward to it. So I will say there is, this is exactly where some of the employee support is really good. So places like Society of Occupational Medicine, CIPD, there are other professional bodies, and also the domestic abuse charities. So this should be a standard part of an employer's consideration of relationships. So it was a very specific question, Linda, thank you. But certainly relationships is part of what we should be thinking about. It should be a part of employee support. Yeah, Remy, do you want to add to that?
Just to say, as you were saying that, I suppose, you know, what I would also say, to echo your words, Nancy, is it's the requirement of much better signposting, people managers being equipped to cope with these things that they start to see, because that is a reality, you know, the invisible becoming visible. And actually that organizations and teams are really encouraged to signpost these sorts of resources, so that it's not something that is sort of slightly at the, you know, the bottom of a web page just in case, but actually these are the realities of what lockdown can present for some people. So signposting of these resources is key, I think.
Yeah, and I think this is a really interesting signal for well-being too. So what we find in the few surveys of children and young people that there have been about their experience of lockdown, we found that primary school kids who are not comfortable at home are the ones who are not coping. Everybody else seems to be fine, and secondary school boys in particular, who are the ones who are lonely, which is not the ones I would expect to be. I had another question, I think it was Guillermo who said it at the beginning, which was about what's the line between being informed and using media and social media for making sure we understand and can inform ourselves of what's going on and make good choices, and that taking care of yourself. And I think it came from one of Remy's so Linda's just said, thank you very much. I do think it's a huge issue. We need to make sure that it's addressed at work. And I agree and I can probably find out some more specific resources, actually. Linda, I'll follow up on that one. Yeah, it was about this line between being informed and taking care of yourself. So that I think you mentioned about media consumption, Remy.
Yeah. I mean, it's something that really showed up. And of course it would, because people are trying to make sense of the numbers and the scale, you know, a global pandemic, the implications for person, self, family, community, etc. And within that, it's my personal opinion that there's a lot of irresponsible journalism that also can occur, which can really take people to their edges of fear and anxiety. And so I think what really was very, very present was this awareness, or growing awareness, that just like your diet, just like if you choose to eat a healthy diet and you would have your whatever it is, whether it's your meat and 2 veg or whether you're vegan, whatever your healthy diet is, that you would be very circumspect about what goes on your plate. And it's exactly the same principle with media consumption, because it does shift our internal state. And when we are already in an anxious environment, or we are in receipt of information that's going to create potentially anxious responses, then being able to really limit that and be circumspect about the quality, the source, and of course these are our own personal decisions, but that level of awareness is absolutely critical. And it was really interesting to see that over the course of lockdown, as people became more vigilant about what they consumed and how they consumed it, everybody noticed that that was the right thing to do. And even down to being on WhatsApp groups, because there's so much judgment, there's so much fear that arises. And in a way, if you're not conscious, you put yourself in the firing line of that. And so I think we all know when we're consuming too much chocolate or sugar. We all know when we're consuming too much media. It's just a level of awareness that we need to bring into our day-to-day lives, which hugely impacts our well-being.
key message there is about sort of noticing the effect it has on you, and thinking about how I am after using that media, as in the same way as you would after having a drink or eating something salty, or noticing that you need exercise, noticing the same thing with your media consumption as well, and working out where the right balance is for you. I think we have a conflict in our house where I like a lot of news and other people in the house do not like it so much, find it more stressful. So actually simple things of like wearing my headphones when I'm listening to it was one way of, or not sharing what I find on the news just before bed and things like that, which probably is not the most stressful thing. I wanted to ask a little bit more about what this might mean for the longer term, and what if any longer term impacts for mental health there might be as a result of this pandemic. I was going to go to I think Hannah Green, and see if you've got any thoughts about what this might mean for people potentially experiencing homelessness now or in the future.
I think it's going to be completely mixed, because there's people I know that were moved into temporary accommodation at the beginning of the pandemic, and they've kind of had 4 months, nearly 5 months, to sort out benefits, to get registered with a GP, to sleep properly, to eat properly. So for them, that is obviously going to be a really positive step moving forwards. But I think there is going to be a lot of people that, once the eviction ban is up, are maybe evicted. So obviously it's going to negatively impact them. But I think it's going to come down to how we move forward, and how people kind of adapt, going back to the new, people keep calling it the new normal, but whatever that means. And I think as well, it's going to go back to when kids are going back to school, how that's handled. Is there going to be this whole focus on they need to catch up and throw in loads more work at them, or is there going to be a focus on making sure that they're okay, and kind of being aware of that?
So there's what the experience is for young people in their education and going back, and also what might happen in particularly for people who are at risk of homelessness as a result of the changes on that in the housing in eviction that may have been temporarily done during this pandemic, and what goes on in the future and how we adapt. Any thoughts from that from Hannah Carver?
Yeah, I think Hannah's points are really important, that it's kind of, I guess, people might have made really positive changes, and we can't assume that everybody's able to do that. So we need to kind of support people where they're at, and I guess put into place things that so people might not be able to kind of make those steps, but others have done, which is excellent. And I think, yeah, just kind of, like, we're all in a similar situation, so we shouldn't be putting pressure on everybody. So I see there's a kind of comment about toxic productivity, and how do we kind of deal with working and living in a situation that's completely alien for all of us. So not putting too much pressure on, as you say, school kids, on ourselves, on each other. As a lecturer, obviously working with students, not assuming that they can all come and attend every single class and do incredibly well, because they've got so many other things that are complex in their lives. So I guess it's being compassionate to each other and ourselves, because it's all a kind of strange situation that we're still kind of learning to deal with. And I think it'll be that long term, like, things might go back to some sort of normality, but there's always going to be something different. There's kind of, yeah, it'll be a different way of working and living, and I think we just kind of need time to get used to. So kind of not putting too much pressure on ourselves and each other to kind of work out how we're doing things, and not judging people in terms of their own choices and stuff. So
a strong message about compassion and thinking about the situations that people are on. And actually that picks up some of the points that Remy was making, and suddenly that we can see a whole world that people are in a whole different way, and understanding that maybe that will give us a better insight into the fact that actually people are very different. One of the things we did in our team was mean, obviously we see people on calls all the time on video, and then we did a who works at a desk like this. So we each shared a picture of our desk to anonymously to one of our team, who then we had to guess who worked at the desks. And you just thought, given that we see this image, that it'd be really easy to do. It really was not. People lived in very different circumstances in the little window that we see just on the video. I have a question in the Q&A, and it's an anonymous question that says, do you have any tips on engaging sensitively with people with a lived experience of certain things? And obviously that's you can take that as you like. And I wondered if somebody would like to pick that up about how to do that. Hannah Green, go for it.
I could write you a dissertation on this, but I think the first thing is, if you're working with someone, the first time you meet them, don't expect a life story from them. You need to focus on building a relationship and rapport with them, and then they'll kind of tell you what they want when they're ready. But if the relationship's not there, if they do tell you their story, they're not going to be comfortable with it. And I think, I was passed around to so many different services, and the first time you go into a new service, you're always expected to tell them your kind of life story, why you sat there, why you're homeless. And I think that's really kind of unhealthy, and probably re-traumatizing, to be fair. So I think it's all about building relationships and meeting people where they're at.
So one of the bits of training I had was, if in doubt, build the relationship. And that sounds like that's where you start, is build the relationship, build the rapport, and thinking sensitively about how many times they will have had to tell that story in engaging with the services that they're on. Is that right? Yeah. Remy, did you want to add anything on that one?
I mean, just to echo that, I think, Hannah's had obviously very extreme lived experiences. Trust is integral for, I see it slightly, I suppose, when somebody is telling me something or sharing something with me, it's such an honor. So, for them to be able to open up in that way, and so to force or to push somebody into a situation where you're constantly having to repeat or re-traumatize yourself because you're being passed around, how can that ever really create the environment of trust, the rapport that we need to help each other out, So just to echo that, I think, listening is key, I think for people, and I consider myself in this, but, people that are in helper roles in the world in terms of offering service, sometimes, we just need to step back. I include myself always in my reflections, to step back from the solution and just listen. And something kind of emerges, as opposed to I can help and this is what I'll do. It's not always about creating the solution, is it? Sometimes it's just about really deepening one's understanding, and that comes from listening, rapport, trust, all the things that have been mentioned.
And so that trust is often referred to as the hidden wealth of nations, and it's certainly the things that make teams work. And Hannah, we've got somebody commenting here that saying that it can be really difficult, so many reasons that it can be difficult to speak out all the stuff out loud, and sort of lots of feelings that are happening, some of them really quite big, and how do you keep dignity and respect in that of yourself in that situation. I'm really looking forward to, I didn't realize you were writing a book, very much looking forward to that myself. I had another question here about from Guillermo again, saying this concept of toxic productivity and how we might be under a lot of pressure to do something meaningful in these difficult times. For instance, we have all these back-to-back meetings, and do we have any practical suggestions on how we can deal with those pressures? And I see this a little bit in the media, where we're sort of almost shamed for having fun, for choosing to go to the beach or to have a night out with friends, however safely we're being. And I think this idea that we took things back down to an essentials, and the only things you can do now are things that matter. So how do we get past this sort of pressure to doing things that must be done at all times? I'm wondering if Remy might want to go on that one. Thank you.
I'll have a go. I think it's a great question, and it's really something that we just need to constantly weed out from our working cultures. And I think that will be helped when leaders get super clear about what's important right now, right? So whether that's hours that your team does or internal outcomes for your team, but really focusing on a clear team working agreement so that people understand what they're working towards, and then encouraging, fostering trust within teams, within organizations, within groups, such that you're not focused on the actual time that it takes. You all know that you're working to a particular outcome. So I think that's something that leaders again need to be aware of when they're starting to shift their leadership and their management styles. That to me is important. Minimize unnecessary email traffic, minimize meetings where possible, reduce internal meetings to 20 minutes, not 45 minutes. Allow people time out in this environment to be able to sort of go away and process, because we're working differently, we're working virtually. That's a big thing. Be aware of difference, cultural difference, time difference, so that when you're creating work events, you create work events that are inclusive, that different people can access at different times, and really vary it up. It's very different for somebody living on their own to somebody that's within a family group, and when both those individuals might be able to work. So I think that's very, very important. And I also think this constant modeling of, which Hannah you spoke to and Nancy you spoke to, this respect for colleagues, needs for their increased flexibility, that we understand that we have to keep checking ourselves. Do we respect the need for increased flexibility? Because it's and are we being empathetic? Are we showing an interest in our colleagues and their personal circumstances? Because really, if we're not, then how can we help ourselves understand what it is other people are going through, and be much more open and compassionate about why, I don't know, Hugh can only deliver something at 9 p.m. at night because he's managing the care for his elderly mother, for example. So, trust, openness, focusing on the task rather than the time spent, and leaders being so clear about what's important for their teams and their organizations, I think is a very, very big step towards that.
Really pleased to hear you say that, Remy. So one of the things that we see in terms of a quality job, which makes a big difference to people's well-being at work, is about having clarity of goals. And the things that helps teams form quickly is about shared approach and values, and the things that matter and important about how we work. And so it's really important to hear that, about being clear about what's important. Not always easy to do, and not always easy to check that that's been communicated, but certainly important. I think I've got time for one last question from, if someone wants to do a Q&A, but before, in case we haven't immediately got one of those, a lovely master plan in there from comment from Guillermo. I had one question then, is so how can we ensure the well-being of frontline workers now and in the future? And I'm going to go, I think, first to Hannah, Hannah Carver, but if anybody else wants to come in on that question, please do.
So I think it's obviously the things that we already know around supervision, reflective practice, support informally and formally, providing access to, I guess, mental health support if people need it. Everything, I guess, that kind of encompasses working within a psychologically informed way, so that you are kind of protected, and that can mean that you're able to, I guess, work better, more effectively with clients if you are kind of able to protect your mental health. But I think also that kind of making sure people can work flexibly, are not kind of under pressure to do things at times that aren't suitable for them, or at times that are kind of, that don't work in terms of deadlines. So that kind of ensuring proper flexible working rather than kind of things that are a bit more vague. And I think just kind of thinking about this for the long term. So we're going to be working in strange ways for a while, so it's kind of making sure that we're not trying to kind of go back to normal straight away. So it might be that we'll end up doing blended stuff where you might meet people face to face, but you can't expect everybody else to do that. So are there going to be things in place where you can have team meetings that allow lots of flexibility for people? And I think just kind of keeping in touch with people and making sure everyone's kind of on board and happy and being supportive, I guess.
So a lot of things we know, and it's working out how we adapt it to this situation. So the supervision, the reflective practice, which is brilliant. It's about how we continue to grow and learn and process things as individuals. An essential way of making sure the learning is tailored to you. So that informal and formal support and the specialist help for where we need it, and so how we operate in a psychologically informed way. I think this idea that we need to be in a blended workspace is really interesting. Hannah and Remy, did you want to add anything? So Sam Price has just said, I think there are positives about working remotely as well, and arranging attending meetings has become easier, for example. And I think I would agree with that, Sam. I think we have colleagues in Cheshire and Yorkshire and Sussex and Wiltshire, as well as London. And what's been really good is we've been able to get everybody in the room, as it were, more often, and people who work more often remotely have felt more part of the team. And so we're trying to work out how we keep that as we go forward, and which has been quite exciting. Anybody else want to add anything on that last question about frontline workers?
Just to echo Hannah's comments about the checking in, I think we really need to check in more with teams, with direct reports. That requirement where you don't see people necessarily passing you, or you don't have the coffee cooler, what's it called, the water cooler conversation. You know, that checking in is actually really important, because it's within that check-in that you can encourage somebody to look after their mental health. You can encourage them to, you know, go for a run or take some time out or whatever. And so I think, again, just that level of awareness, as we work, the future of work continues to change, and we are all more disparate. That's checking in is an important piece.
So again, just thinking about how we do those check-ins when we don't have the accidental bumping spaces that you get in an office where you're in the queue, or where you step out together. That's brilliant. So I think we're nearly at our time. I'm just going to ask our panelists just one shared thing about one practical thing that you've found useful over the last 5 months that you'd like to share with our audience. And I'm going to start with Hannah Green, if that's okay.
For me, I think the most important thing has been talking. And yes, talking if you're not doing great, and asking for help. But even if you're doing okay, just talking, and that social contact, I think that's been really important, especially because I live alone as well. So going like days without seeing anyone or without interacting with anyone would have been really hard. So yeah, talk.
Clear message about the importance of social connection there. Thank you. Hannah Carver.
I totally agree with Hannah. So I've had to think of another one. I think getting outside. So we've talked about how we kind of can't. We're always at our screens. Like, you might get up in the morning, you start doing work, and then you could easily be there 12 hours later. So I think there's kind of really important about being outside in nature. Obviously, I've mentioned I have done some work in green space, and it's really important to kind of get outside, clear your head, go for a walk, do some gardening, go running, go find a hill, climb up it, do something that kind of gets you away from working. And sometimes that can motivate you and spark ideas, and other times it'll just make you feel better. So I think try and close your laptop and go outside and do that for yourself, because yeah, you're only human, so don't kind of put too much pressure on yourself. So
I'm glad you took the go outside bit in there with getting your green space working. I think one of the things that surprises me repeatedly from the wellbeing literature is the importance of engagement with green space. And where I live in London, I think we've seen it's so important for people, particularly if they've got small space, physical space, to have that time slightly away from those four walls. Remy, what was your thing you'd leave us with?
I mean, I echo both of those. Talking, for me, nature has been absolutely critical in terms of just really allowing me to decompress. So I walk a lot. I suppose my other practice that I would share is I have a very, very long-standing meditation practice, which I know some people find meditation challenging. But if even before meditation, doing something like a breath work where you go for a walk and you just sit down and you just breathe deeply, into your belly, breathe, take 10 conscious breaths, because, we are a nation of breath holders. And I think in stressful circumstances, by the end of the day, you can kind of be like that and like that, there's no air. So being able to make sure that we are filling our lungs, just to allow some of the charge from these situations to occur, to release, is really, really important. So I think nature and any sort of daily practice, meditation or breath work. And I think for me personally, that's really how I ease my thinking, is, those sorts of activities, really. Yeah.
Thank you. I think you've just pinched my one, which was I say I have to remember to breathe. So breathing in for 4 and out for 4.
Brilliant.
But actually, the one I will say, which I think Hannah Green said earlier on, was the importance of physical activity and exercise for me. It's not something I will bounce out of bed to do, but I know I have to do it. And actually, it's the thing I miss with my commute is I don't get the half an hour walk every day. And so making sure I get my physical activity in is something that I have to work hard to do, but I know is important. It helps me sleep better as well. So I think we've wrapped up most of the questions that I think, if Guillermo will nudge me if I've forgotten one, but I just want to take the opportunity just to wrap up some of the themes that we've talked about. So we've talked about how staff are experiencing the pandemic in the last 5 months, and how we adapt some of the things that we know work to that new context. So that supervision, that frontline, that support, informal and formal, how we get that right, and the importance of teams and teamwork and the relationship building more generally. And we've talked quite a lot about the importance of not social distancing, but physical distancing. So we're still socially connected, but we are physically apart a bit more, about how people are managing multiple challenges in lots of different ways around their boundaries, about how they're sort of just a whole new range of challenges that we're seeing in people's lives, some of which are welcome and some really positive things that have come out of it. That make it easier, but some challenges too about the boundaries that we have with other people, and about how we can bring our the experience of adversity and how that can help in this context. So how you sort of just get on with it and make the best of things, how you manage that feeling of lack of control, and the fear of the unknown, and about how we can sort of get acceptance in that situation with those feelings. And then we've also talked quite a lot about what this might mean for the future, and how we can sort of build this learning about what's important into how we go forward, but also what that might mean for people who may be at risk from experiencing homelessness, and what that might mean when the things like have been on pause almost start to appear again at the end. So I would like to say thank you to all of our panelists. So we've had Dr. Hannah Carver, who is a lecturer in substance use at the University of Stirling. We've had Hannah Green, who's the lived experience expert here at the Centre for Homelessness Impact, who I'm looking forward to reading your book as well in the future, and Remy Olajoy-Egbe, who is the strategic impact coach, mentor and social entrepreneur, but with also this bringing huge experience of helping people work with the experience of what it's like at the moment, and how what we can do to make a difference. So thank you so much, all of you on the panel. We'll follow up with, I think there was 1 or 2 specific questions, but thank you so much to everyone today and to all the great questions we've had. I've really enjoyed it, and we finished on time as well. Guillermo, do you want to say about the next sessions, or shall I?
Do you want me to say about the next session?
Yeah, please.
So we have a session starting at 3:30, which is giving us an insight into the views and how the Northern Irish government have responded to the pandemic in terms of homelessness. And I believe Guillermo has just dropped a link into the chat. So if anyone wants to sign up, please do. And if you want to carry the conversation on Twitter as well, using the hashtag CHIFest2020.
So thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you all so much. Hope the rest of the festival goes well.